This is question number 13, and it says the diagram shows an individual demand curve for a commodity. The supplier of the commodity charges a unit price P, but the consumers are currently required to purchase a minimum quantity OQ. Which area in the diagram measures the net gain in consumer surplus from the removal of minimum purchase requirement? So if there's a minimum purchase requirement, let's figure out what's the consumer surplus with the minimum purchase requirement and what's the consumer surplus if that requirement is taken away, and then we'll compare the consumer surplus to find out the net gain. So let's look at what's the consumer surplus when there's a minimum purchase requirement. So consumer surplus is simply amount consumers are willing to pay minus amount they actually pay. Right? So in this question, when you are buying sort of Q, if I label this A, then what would happen would be what consumers are willing to pay would be all the area under the demand curve for this quantity Q, which would mean the consumers are willing to pay X plus Y plus A, because area under the demand curve for a particular quantity is what we call our willingness to pay. What they actually pay is this amount Y plus Z plus A. In other words, P times Q. So what they actually pay is Y plus Z plus A. Does that make sense? Which would mean my consumer surplus would be X plus Y plus A minus Y minus Z minus A. So A and A go away, Y and Y go away. So we're left with X minus Z. So this is my consumer surplus when we have a minimum purchase requirement. Okay, now let's find out what's the consumer surplus when there is no minimum purchase requirement. Well, if there is no minimum purchase requirement, then the consumer will only be buying at this price P some quantity like Q dash, and his consumer surplus will be basically area under the demand curve above the market price or this region, right? So his consumer surplus will actually be X. Okay, so what's the net gain in consumer surplus when you remove? It's going to be, the net gain will be the consumer surplus X, which is this one, minus the consumer surplus that we get here, which is X minus Z, and therefore the right answer would be X minus X plus Z, or we're left with Z, which is basically D only. D will be, or Z only will be the consumer surplus that will be gained if we remove this minimum purchase requirement.